Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me again. I hope you're doing well in this crazy, crazy, crazy ass world. I really appreciate you tuning in. As usual, my numbers have been going up steadily, and I'm just so excited. Oh my God, it's so cool. I really appreciate you listening. I really, really do. And if you haven't already, one thing that does help podcasters and any kind of digital content creators is sharing episodes that you like, commenting, subscribing, telling your friends about it, help spreading the word. If you like the superficial spirit and you want me to keep going, then tell somebody that you love to take a listen. Also, hit me up on social media at Peter Breeze. I'm always open to discussing topics. And I actually met someone recently, my first ever friend that I met through the podcast, who reached out to me because of a recent episode. And we are actually going to be doing a Zoom in the next few days to sort of, the cool thing about spirituality is that a lot of people have really quick opinions about it. Like when they're listening to the show or they're engaging in conversations about spirituality, it usually triggers something internally, positive, negative, indifference. From my experience, it's pretty polarizing just because people do tend to have a strong opinion about religion, which they sort of lump together with spirituality. And in my last few episodes, they've been pretty heavy on the spiritual content. And a bunch of people reached out to me, and one of them, I just have been having the greatest conversation with her, and I'm excited to carry that over to Zoom and maybe Instagram Live. We're trying to figure out the best way to share the conversation. But the cool thing about the podcast is that it's growing organically, and the types of episodes I have, I'm really open to. I don't really plan too far ahead. I basically think about people that I find interesting, that I want to interview, people who have unique perspectives, and I interview them. But I'm also not tied to the fact that the person I'm interviewing needs to be popular or famous or on TV or an influencer, because I feel like that doesn't necessarily make someone interesting. I have interviewed some famous people and it was great, but I also have really amazing conversations with people that aren't famous and will never be famous. And I think that when it comes to spirituality and pop culture, it's important to listen to voices that are observers mostly, because when you're really in the thick of your beliefs and your lifestyle, it's hard to see other perspectives. And so if you have any ideas for the show, or if you want to be on the show, let me know. Tell me your story. I want to know what your spiritual experiences have been. What is unique about it? How did you uncover your authenticity? How did you search for the divine? Or what are you opposed to? What has gone wrong? This is another really popular topic that I'm learning. People have had a lot of negative experiences when they commit themselves to these modern spiritual concepts like law of attraction, how you can manifest your own reality, health starts in your mind, all of these things that sound so good, and it can quite possibly derail you. Are also conversations I'm really excited to have. This is not a podcast to regurgitate concepts that have been written about and talked about over and over and over again. It's an examination, and it's a place to share. I don't have an agenda other than talking about my own personal journey and hearing other people's journey and fucking sitting in front of my ring light, honey. That's all I care about. Anyway, today's show, super excited as usual. So I'm lucky that in my personal journey, I have met a lot of really, really dynamic, polarizing people. If you've listened to the podcast, you've heard from some of them. And even though I look back at my life now and I can see there's definitely roots in spirituality from the very beginning. I remember praying before I knew what that was. I was always interested in the concept of God and following my dreams and feeling a strong sense of purpose. And early in my life, in high school, and right when I graduated, I crossed paths with some really amazing people that I'm still friends with today. And one of those people is my next guest. He is a naturopathic doctor, and this is the whole world of natural medicine is something that hits pretty close home to me and to Evan, because we because Evan had some really serious health issues. I've talked about this before on the show. He was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. He had to go on life support. He had a tumor in his chest that he had to be removed. And we originally sought help through natural means. You know, we really, really did believe that if we did experience physical illness, it's something that could be cured naturally. And although I do think there is value in that way of thinking, we actually did ourselves a huge disservice by turning our back to Western medicine when he needed it the worst. And I think Evan actually, when we needed it the most, and I think actually Evan could have gotten better faster if we would have taken the medicine recommended by the Western doctors instead of, you know, rigidly holding on to the diet, the meditation, the acupuncture, the spiritual healing, the oils, the supplements, all of these things that I wanted to believe could cure his cancer and his autoimmune disease, didn't. I guess maybe they relieved some symptoms initially, but we can definitely say that it was the Western medicine that got him out of the life-threatening condition he was in. And so now when people, you know, I don't want to get too far into this because I want to share it with my guests. But anyway, my next guest is Paul. He's from Calgary. Paul Theriault. He is a naturopathic doctor. I've known him since high school, and he's a great friend to Evan and I. And I'm really excited to have him on the show to sort of talk about his insight on why people should choose natural medicine and, you know, some success stories that he has, and also how COVID fits into all of this, the spiritual and mental part of health. So without further ado, honey, all the way from Calgary, it's Paul, Dr. Paul. Dr. Paul, that's what I call him. Oh my God, Paul.
Hi, Peter.
How are you, Angel?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. You look like you're wrapped up in a nice little cozy scarf or blanket or something.
My nice blanket. It makes me
Oh.
happy.
Oh, is it cold there in Calgary?
Not particularly, but my blanket is very nice and comfortable.
Oh, it looks great. Are you in your new place now?
Yes. New house. This is the library room where I do most of my work and my interviews and everything like that. So.
Oh my God, you have a new house.
I do. It's very nice. So.
And you painted the walls blue? Obviously.
No, the blues were I've lived here for a month. I haven't painted anything. So this room came in blue and everything. So it's funny
because nice
I want the upstairs room to be I was like, I'm having this discussion with my brother right now because he's living with me. He's like, Paul, I'm gonna paint here the house for you. I'm like, all right, I want it like aquamarine, sky blue and everything. He's like, I don't want to do that. I'm like, you don't get a vote. My house. So
that's right. It is your fucking house. You need to make it what you want. You know, I will say that like living with Evan now for like, I don't know, 6 years, we moved in together pretty quickly. And I will say that like most of our big fights have come from like combining two people's way of living. When we first met, it was, he liked to put everything on the counter in the bathroom, like the lotions and the toothbrush and everything was on the counter. And I like everything away. Like I want to see a clean line on the counters, and he's the opposite. So that started like when we first met. And then when we move into new places, because we've lived into quite a few, it's always like the decor thing, right? Because everybody thinks that their style is the best style. And it's interesting. Okay, so why don't you tell me a little bit, first of all, let's talk about how we met in high school. How fucking crazy is that?
Yeah, no, so me and Peter have known each other since I think like 2000 or something like that. And we both went to John Diefenbaker High School in Calgary together. So I was in the IB program, but dropped out because I didn't like anybody there. And then just became, you know, and then I made a bunch of friends, so I stayed there. And then Peter was a year behind me, and we ended up becoming friends together and so forth. And we ended up working at Callaway Park together, weirdly enough. And yeah, no, and then we just stayed in touch after that and everything. And I was fortunate enough to go and be part of Peter's descent into Club Madness and everything else.
One of my
all the time.
One of my favorite memories of you was we went to the club and all of me and my friends were doing ecstasy and you were like rubbing essential oils on your body. You're like, I don't need drugs.
And it's true. I never did. All of my friends would go around and like I had a bunch of groups of friends that would just go and like do X or do whatever the fancy drug of the day was. A bunch of the times they were doing acid or something like that. And I would just have my drinks and be like, yeah, no, I don't really need that. And I don't. Like I get
Yeah.
all these weird essential I get all these weird like spiritual experiences without the need of drugs most of the time and so forth. And, even more interestingly, just because I'm me, I would pick up a lot of those experiences and I would just, I would just like, oh, my friends are doing drugs. And I kind of feel like them because I'm sitting beside them and, oh, this is not my thing. But, it's just the way I am that way. So I remember one time a friend did LSD and we were just sat in his house and watched Teletubbies the whole time. And it made perfect sense to me right then. I'm like, of course there's a baby in the damn sun. Ah. It
Wait,
was
were you on LSD or just he was?
he was.
So you say that like growing up when everybody was experimenting with drugs, you already experienced naturally similar, well, what you would interpret as similar experiences, like you would get yourself high, I guess, quote unquote high without the use of mind altering substances. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And
Can
just
you,
because
yeah, explain that a little more.
yeah, no, just because I'm me, I would often like pick up, I get a hint of it just from being around other people and so forth. But yeah, no, that's just the way I was. I was always kind of tuned into that. I suppose I come from a family of like of hereditary clairvoyance, so there was always like a thing there, and I just picked it up I just kind of picked up all these states on my own and all these like things and everything, and I could always do those things very easily. And so it was quite a revelation that people took drugs to get to that place that I could go to just because I practiced and everything
Yeah.
because I had this gift to do it. So yeah.
I remember also, now that you mentioned the clairvoyant thing, you would always tell me about my aura. I remember. I was
Oh,
like,
that's
what
right. I
color?
did.
Yeah.
That's right. I did. It was, well, that was a fun thing I did back in the day before I knew to be perhaps a tad more discreet with how I described such things.
Well, you stood out so much to me because, I mean, all of my, I guess, like if I were to describe it in the simplest way, like my friends and I were very focused on like a hedonistic lifestyle. You know, I wanted to be famous. A lot of my friends liked that lifestyle. We were into excessive partying, and you would like come in and out of my life, but you were so on a different plane. And like, I never really understood back then. Like now I can see, looking back, I always had kind of roots in spirituality, just being curious as a kid. But somebody like you coming into my life is quite peculiar because you always were sort of in that way of thinking before I was even aware of it. And I love that we're still in touch. And now that I am more aware of it, because you've been a great source to me. Like we talk often throughout my journey about, you know, where I'm at, what I need to do. And you've been a great resource for me. And I think that's great that we met so young and we were able to stay in touch.
Well, yeah, no, it's very funny because you know, I often think that I probably would have ended up on a very similar path. It's just I don't know, my kind of change was involuntary in a number of ways. Me kind of going on that path wasn't really a conscious choice I ever made. It's kind of like, having my family and so forth. And it's a very interesting thing because it's family of hereditary clairvoyance, but we never talk about it to kids. It's just like, oh, you wake up to it and then you talk to your family about it and like, oh yeah, we all have that and so forth.
Okay.
It's a interesting thing that way. It's like, talking to grandma who uses her psychic powers to like, you know, keep an eye on her grandchildren and so forth, or mom who used them in her work with people with disabilities a lot of the time, or my brother and so forth who uses it in business, or me who uses it naturopathically, medically, and so forth. There's, and in terms of some other things that I do. So it's interesting that way. And then I just had a bunch of quite frankly scary mystical experiences starting when I was 13, and those were kind of interesting. Like I've actually been public about it for a while now because I'm a naturopathic doctor. Nobody gives a shit about what I say anymore. I don't have to be respectable, so I have to abide by the guidelines of the Health Practitioners of Active Alberta. But anything like weird otherwise, like I don't care anymore. So
I want to understand like fully what you mean when you say clairvoyant and like growing up with a family that experienced that. Like, can you sort of give us some examples of when you were young and when you realized you experienced the world differently?
Oh, okay. So when I was maybe 10 or 11 or 12, I started realizing that I had this little thing around me, this like field, and today I would call it the vitality. So it's like, in theosophical work, they call it the etheric body. It's about an inch off your skin, and I could move it. And so I could feel it. I could feel something outside of my skin, and then I could move it, and I could like move it into other people's, and I would feel like what they're feeling or something like that, and everything like that. And I just like, oh wow, this is a great discovery. I'm amazing. I discovered this thing nobody's ever discovered before. Many people have discovered this before, but I'd never known about it and so forth. So I would make interesting discoveries that way, and then kind of as I progressed that way, I'd start having these encounters with these beings that I'm going to say weren't human. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and there was like an alien staring at me or something like that. And, part of the thing with being, so I have encounters of this nature, and they were really, really interesting and so forth. So yeah, I'd start having encounters with these other worldly beings and communicating with them and everything else like that. And yeah, they're really interesting.
So
So
that was when you mentioned that you had some scary experiences. It was with those beings that came to you when you woke up in the middle of the night.
yeah, no, they're terrifying.
Is
So,
it like, are you seeing them in physical form, like I'm in front of you right now? And
yeah.
what did they do in your
Uh,
room?
we would just sit, and well, they would just kind of sit there, and I wouldn't be able to move, and we just kind of like stare at each other. But like communicating with them is really weird because it's not like talking. It's like there's this whole like of things that comes to you all at once when you're communicating with them. It's not even like telepathy on TV. Telepathy on TV, you just kind of hear people's thoughts, and it's like having a conversation with that. It's not like that with them. It's like this and you're just sensing everything that's going on in them, and they're sensing that everything that's going on with you. And it's you kind of occasionally get, like, very, very rarely, it's like you kind of get that during sex, at least very rarely when I do. You kind of do that, and it's kind of like that, except there's not a sex component with them and everything. So it's a really interesting phenomena. And then after a thing with that, I'd always find that like some new ability would turn on or something like that. Like I just know automatically how to do something psychically that I never did before. So that was really fun. That was really
So,
interesting to me, even though they were quite scary to me.
so do you feel like these beings were coming to you and they were there to give you some kind of gift, or do you think that was just a byproduct of them visiting and they were there for a different reason?
Well, that's an interesting thing, Peter. I right now there are several schools of thought on the matter. First of which is that these beings are very selective in who they go and communicate with and everything like that. The second of which is that these kind of encounters, probably different, but like, probably, slightly different, but these beings, these things come and visit everybody. And it's just some people remember them.
Mm.
There are a number of, so they've done sociological studies of like, alien abductees and people who have mystical experiences. And there are a number of factors that quite often are held in common. There's a lot that aren't, but there's a number of factors that are held in common. And the hypothesis that I really like is that everyone has these encounters. It's just some people remember them more than others.
Mm.
Some people have like a lot of people will just oh there'll be an encounter with one of these beings or like something else that's very similar, and then you're just through the natural process of being human and the bodies that we have and with the vitalities that we have, you just kind of not remember them and bury them. It's like a dream, you kind of like just it kind of goes to the back of your mind. And then yeah, I know some people just are a little bit less susceptible to that kind of burying, which that's the hypothesis I favor at the moment.
How do you think these types of experiences relate to like because there's my interest in these types of experiences is like since I was a kid, I've always been like fascinated by aliens and UFOs. And I
Mhm.
saw UFOs once. I do remember I thought they were Canadian geese because they were flying in formation and they flew over me really fast, but they
Yeah,
weren't.
yeah.
That was when I was probably in grade 6. And I did have a strange experience with this guy kept calling. I basically, okay, I responded to an ad on Craigslist. I was in between jobs when I was living in Vancouver, and it was a paranormal group. And they were like, you know, we meet often, we talk about experiences. And I was like, oh my God, that would be so great to fill my time. And this guy immediately started calling me, and I had a few strange conversations where, you know, he basically like verbally diarrhea told me everything he knew about conspiracy theories, UFOs, and was like trying to figure out what I knew. And it was a great conversation that maybe lasted 30 minutes. And then we ended, but then he called me obsessively. And I was like, this is really fucking weird. I don't know this guy. And it creeped me out enough where I felt like almost like he was watching me, even though I have no evidence to support that. It just gave me this very strange feeling that he was contacting me all the time. So I actually stopped going on YouTube and following that storyline because I was like, I think I'm going too far into the black hole. Anyway, about a year later, Evan took me away for my birthday, and we were at Harrison Hot Springs. And because it was my birthday, I was like, you know, I'm going to treat myself. I'm going to buy a UFO book because I haven't in so long. As soon as I sat down in the fucking hotel room to start reading it, that guy called me again. And I was like, this is Men in Black shit. And so it's so crazy. And I feel personally like attracted to these kinds of stories and experiences. And I guess for somebody like you, I find it interesting because like some people would argue, you know, there's not a lot of evidence for this, and, you know, being clairvoyant and stuff is not something that can be proven. And then you go and you have a full profession based on naturopathic medicine and healing people, which is also a controversial field. So I feel like you're a great What?
I have thoughts on that line.
Yes. I think it's so interesting that you not only are a naturopathic doctor, you are also somebody who experiences paranormal phenomenon. And what an interesting way to merge those worlds and then offer your services to people to heal them. And I think, wow, like what a unique story. And I want to hear what you have to say because it's fucking interesting.
Well, it's an intriguing thing. So yeah, no, I'm a naturopathic doctor and so forth, and it's funny because I've part of that. It's like I've got a bachelor's in biological science and cultural anthropology, which really helped me with naturopathic medicine. And then I got my naturopathic doctorate, and then I've taken, you know, I've been in practice for 10 years, so I've been taking graduate training in a number of things like, oh God, I've like had this huge amount of training in pharmacy and all this training and like all this other kind of thing. And I've just because I do a lot of homeopathy, I've had to familiarize myself with the research there and so forth. And just because I've always liked psychic phenomena, I familiarized myself with the research there. So the controversy surrounding these subjects is horseshit. It's like absolutely ridiculous. If we know anything with science, if we accept philosophically that the scientific method and statistics and so forth can show us anything about the nature of reality, we know that psychic ability exists. So there's a researcher called Dean Radin, and he's a what's the word? Oh God, what's the word? He's a parapsychologist. He's a really interesting researcher, and he has done a number of like meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are when you put a number of, in medicine, clinical trials, I want to say, but in psychology, it's experiments. You put a number of experiments together and you kind of analyze them. And if you have more repeated experiments, you have what's called greater statistical power. The ability to detect phenomenon becomes much more, you know, solid and so forth. You know, you put 10 trials of, you know, 100 people together, then you've got like this combined statistical analysis of 1,000 people. So it's really good. So Dean Radin has done analyses on things like distant intentions, on pre-knowledge, so, you know, knowing something before it happens, and quite interestingly, often without consciousness, like a person will have a physiological reaction, but their conscious mind won't know anything. But, you know, you show them a noxious stimulus, and like a couple seconds before, their skin will change electrical conductivity without any conscious knowledge. Things like prayer and distant healing, things of like intending things like, you know, or so they've got a number of these experiments there, and some of them, and I'm sorry for your listeners who want the exact references and the exact phenomenon, but some of them have been demonstrated to the effect of like 6 sigma. So a sigma is a standard deviation from like the mean in a bell curve. So a couple of sigma is defined as, you know, statistically significant, and 6 is unheard of. Like 6 is like, if we know anything with the scientific method, we know this is occurring. So the idea that there is no proof or that these things are controversial, it's kind of like how it's controversial about how, you know, gay people are diseased or inherently disordered or something like that. There are a lot of people who think that, but it's nonsense. And it's
Okay.
very similar with other, like, psychic phenomena is quite easy to study because you can just, like, experimentally, it's quite simple. You can, you know, there's a number of really good experimental methodologies that have been improved over the last half century and so forth. Medicine's a little harder, but there are many of the people who object to other things that I do, like homeopathy or like various other things, are not, I'm going to say, as conversant with the literature as I am. So this is the
Okay.
wonderful thing about that, is like, you know, people are like, Paul, there's no evidence for that. I'm like, oh, well, oh my gosh, you've converted me, random person who knows fucking nothing about what I do. You've said there's no evidence. Oh, I've seen the light. Like, it's not the case. Like, I've written a bunch of peer-reviewed papers on the evidence for homeopathy is my thing. So just because I do a lot of homeopathy, and the evidence for homeopathy is at this point unequivocal. So unequivocal means no really fiddling about with it. There's a guy named Matthew who's I think he was a social worker, a psychologist in England, and he was commissioned to do a literature review of all of the major clinical trials on homeopathy. So clinical trials are a lot harder than just putting someone in a room and psychically experimenting and so forth. So that you can do like thousands of things relatively low cost. Clinical trials are hard and expensive, but he managed to come together with them and did this series of you know, research reviews and so forth. And I reviewed. So I wrote this paper about a year ago, and it's called I forgot the title of it, but I wrote this review concerning every kind of meta-analysis of homeopathy that's ever been done. And so the interesting thing was, when you have a good one, when you have one that's methodologically sound and doesn't include things or exclude things randomly, and doesn't sometimes frankly lie to the public, you get a positive result. And Matthew recently is I've seen the paper, I've seen him present on it. There's a paper published where he gets like every high quality clinical trial of homeopathy, and there's enough of them, and they're positive enough that we can say unequivocally, this works. So this is just the field that I've, you know, educated myself on. So we can say with the firm confidence of the scientific method that these things are positive. And the people who are not saying that are usually pretty ignorant of that. They're usually going on other things other than a thorough knowledge of the research,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to psychic phenomena or homeopathy or naturopathic medicine and so forth, of which there's not as much research as we like, but there's a ton. So
Yeah, I think this is a common thing that you hear nowadays about, because of the internet, it's really easy to gain knowledge
yeah,
in both sides. Like, you can really dive deep into something you're passionate about and learn all the facts and statistics and read about clinical trials and stuff. But you can also go the opposite direction, where it's like, it's false narratives and it's fake news and it's conspiracy theories. And people are often like, you know, if you don't understand, it's because you haven't done the research. And I feel like it's a dangerous time to tell people to do research, because it
yeah.
really depends on where they're getting their resources.
Tons.
Because, yeah, and I think also, you know, it's good to hear that you are constantly, you're hungry for the knowledge, because I think people's knee-jerk reaction, not everybody, some people's knee-jerk reaction is like, it's not real. And then you've really spent a lot of time being able to respond to that in a way that grounds you in facts and in reality, which I think probably makes people feel a little bit more confident about it.
Yeah.
And also, with some of these things, you know, experiencing a psychic phenomenon, or being healed through natural processes, is something that, if it does happen to you, being visited by aliens, if it does happen to you, you know without a doubt that it's real. And
Mhm.
sometimes the human experience surpasses what we are able to prove. I feel, even though there is a lot of research,
Yeah.
that there is also the other side, is like, You know, have you ever been to a fucking psychic that told you something that nobody else could know? Like, if you've had that experience, then you know that it's crazy. And I'm not talking about you're going to fall in love, you're going to win the lottery. I'm talking
Mhm.
about somebody you've never met with, you've
Mhm.
never known before, who says something about your childhood, your past, something specific, or about your inner world that nobody else could possibly know. I mean, these things do happen every day.
Yeah, well, and that's funny too, because there's a bunch of clinical trials of that, and again, a demonstrated phenomenon with so like this is indeed very much the case now. So the issue we're on spirituality person as well, and that's um it's really funny that like that's been a thing that I've been speaking against for a little while right now. What we have in the kind of the contemporary world is a problem, anthropologically speaking, of narrative. People have these overarching narratives that they're trying to make sense in their lives, these stories, these ways of organizing their perception of the world, and they're fitting a lot of stuff kind of going into that. So, and there's not like one big narrative that everyone's going around. Oop, am I still there? Okay.
Yeah, you're still here.
Sorry, sorry. My little computer was flashing unstable. There's not a one big narrative. There's a couple of competing ones right now, and they are all suffering from a very similar kind of deficit right now. Is this tendency to discard things that lie outside of their view of reality? There's kind of like I. It's very good to call it the conspirituality narrative or the kind of QAnon narrative or anything else like that. But there's also this, I'm going to call it this materialist narrative, this one that that has this materialist worldview that the physical is the only thing that is real, we and disregards everything outside of it, and then kind of almost, what's the word, totemizes science as this in this almost religious fashion. So those two narratives are kind of the big ones right now, and they're kind of clashing and fighting with each other and everything else like that. And it's very funny to say. I think they're both stupid. I think they're both awful. So it's like, I'm a psychic, alien abductee, naturopathic doctor. And I can't stand the QAnon narrative. I think it's ridiculous. So I mean, like, let that sink in for a second. You're gone, like, you have these encounters as a child and you read a little bit about them and so forth. Like, I remember when conspiracy theorists were concerned about the government taking too much power and instituting martial law and putting people into concentration camps and so forth, and now they're all cheering for Donald Trump to do that and everything like that. I'm like, you lost your way and so forth. It's not even that I accept all the stuff beforehand that they were doing before, but at the very least they were quite consistent. Now they're all like cheering all this ridiculous stuff, and now there's a bunch of materialist people who are like, oh, we need to trust the science, we need to do this, that, and the other thing. And here I am like, well, the science says this, and I know you don't like to acknowledge that, but it does. And the usual response is to denigrate me and just naturopathic doctors are witch doctors. What the fuck are you doing, Paul? You have no right in the public discourse or to contribute to anything. And one gets like, I'm a gay boy who grew up in the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah.
I know, I have experience being denigrated for inherent characteristics. So it's funny how those two, oh my God, I love gay people and everything else, but fuck you and everything you stand for being a naturopath, Paul. So
Totally, yeah.
yeah.
And
So
people just assume, yeah, that science and what you do don't go hand in hand, but what you're saying is they do actually.
yeah, no, there is, they do, and I'm gonna tell you, I probably know better than you. So I do have a professional degree and 10 years of graduate experience in this. So like, again, that doesn't necessarily mean I succeed on every case, or that there aren't cases where I might not refer to other practitioners or anything else for. But yeah.
That's a good segue, because what I did want to ask you is about some of your success stories, like some great results that you've had from personal work. I mean, I know you can't really talk about your clients specifically, but maybe some
All
general
right.
examples.
Yes. So I've got some general examples. one of my, and I know I've published this case, so she's one of my favorite patients, and I just adore her. She started to see me for chronic fatigue maybe 3 years ago. We worked on that. Her adrenal glands and her stress response were out. We started balancing them with some glandular extracts, some diet, and some acupuncture. She had a couple of chronic infections. We worked on those, and then she kind of, this is a phenomenon I've noticed when you clarify the physical, quite often people's mental, emotional problems, their place where they're stuck in their personal evolution will start to emerge. If you talk to some of the practitioners in India, where generally people's vital forces are much less suppressed, I have found from my experience working with the Indian homeopathic doctors and so forth, they'll just, you know, the Indian patients will just come in and like, boop, and so forth in India. In North America, quite often people need a little help clarifying that first. Sometimes it happens, but not often. So anyway, we did this, we worked on this, and then she came to me and started describing this immense feeling of guilt. She felt like she was not contributing even slightly to her household and her husband and everything, and to her family. She felt she was just this constant drain, and she felt so bad about this that she was starting to experience suicidal ideation. So she was like, I'm just so fucking useless. I can't, like, they would be all better off without me and everything like that. So this was her deep inner state. This was driving a lot of her pathology. And so my success story with that is I gave her a homeopathic remedy that I proved myself. That, you know, proving in homeopathic medicine means you discover the curative processes, the curative state of a remedy, what a remedy can be used for. So I gave her a remedy that I discovered, I made myself, and she recovered. She doesn't feel anymore. It took a long time. We put her on this remedy. She's been on it. She immediately had she was so much better after doing it. But she's been on this remedy for about 3 years now, and she continually, every couple of months, she comes back. She's like, you know, we change the potency, give her a more powerful version of it occasionally, and she has gotten so much better, and her life is so much better, and she's in university now and able to handle the workload, and like it's really made this like gigantic shift in her life and
That's
so
so
forth.
great.
Remedy I made myself, and I'm like, oh my
Woohoo!
god, best thing in the world. So
yeah, so one thing that I'm hearing from that is typically the physical symptoms in the body are stemming from something emotionally or spiritually that's going on that you haven't acknowledged.
I would suggest that the physical symptoms, one of the major contributors is, I call them these developmental problems. So it's not often the only one. Like if you're eating your food intolerance, there's going to be a problem eventually. Sometimes this problem will manifest decades from now. Sometimes it's right now and here with you. There's going to be a problem. If you're living in a toxic environment, there's going to be a problem. If you've got bacteria or viruses or infectious organisms that are around you that your body's not dealing with effectively, there's going to be a problem. But many of those problems are made worse and set up by, I call them developmental states. And that's just something I suppose you might say I have a particular expertise in, is treating those. And I actually have a nice little speech. Oh, can I tell you my little thing
Yes,
about this?
please.
So humans, and so part of my big thing as a naturopathic doctor, in addition to reviewing the research that other people have done, is I do what's called triturations. So I will go and make a plant, a mineral into a homeopathic remedy. And the process of doing that really does, for someone who's sensitive like myself, you start to understand what the remedy is good for, what the symptoms it has are. So this is a big part of my praxis, my research, and everything like that. So, and as part of that, and you know, other people have done this work too. I find our work parallels nicely together. As part of that, a big part is kind of understanding that humans, as biological organisms, but also as spiritual organisms, have this developmental process that we go through. We kind of start we have this series of stages that we achieve from conception to what I think the natural human destiny is, which is kind of enlightenment, or you know, however you want to call that. And I think if we were fully healthy, we'd all probably achieve this in our mid 30s, early 40s, something like that. But there's a number of reasons why we don't. That's another whole topic. But these kind of developmental stages, they're kind of a continuum, but you can divide them into stages and so forth. And quite often people will get stuck in a stage. They'll have like a problem in it that they can't resolve. That woman I told you about, there's a stage where I call it the nest. So it's like you're trying to create an environment in the world where you are safe physically. You trying to create a family, take care of yourself, create, as I call it, that's just the word that I came up with, create a nest for yourself in the world with family and kids and, a job and paying the bills and, cleaning and like all that kind of thing. That was where her issue was. And she just on her own had this problem with that wasn't resolvable. Quite often it's not even fully conscious. Like there's a certain art towards getting that out of people. And quite often people, when they're full of like, illnesses or filled with something else, they won't talk about that. You got to clear their vital force a little bit in order to do that. But that is quite often a fundamental determinant of much of their pathology. It's not everything, but it's a big chunk of it. Sometimes you just find that remedy for people and they're like, oh, everything's better. It's like one in like 200 people or something like that. It does happen, but quite often it's a really big shift. And, I'll do my acupuncture, I'll do my herbs, my diet and everything else like that. And then people will come back and it's like, oh, well, here's my problem. Here's my real thing that's bugging me. And then you kind of I use homeopathy to treat that, but I'm sure there's other ways too. And then you do that. And then people, they move past that point. They're like they move past, say the nest, or say that in order they are, do I exist or not? Am I separate from the rest of the world or not? That's where a lot of people in kind of the spirituality movement get into this codependent narcissist dynamic. Because that's, are you separate from someone or not? You can be a codependent or a narcissist or anything else like that whole conflict. What's your identity? Who are you? The nest, that's kind of the fourth one. The fifth one is like, okay, there's people outside of my nest and they're different than me. How do I deal with that? Like, the idea of difference. How do I deal with difference within myself, which is huge, which contributes hugely to creativity. The sixth one is we are in a period. Sixth one is very much one that we're in collectively right now, and it's kind of to do with society, the rules, the norms. Are these just? Are all these fair? Are these fair? How do we navigate them? How do we improve them? Kind of like the big social one that we are collectively really towards the end of right now. The seventh one is, I think that you personally are in, Peter, just from how I know you, not that I'm trying to read your, anything right now, but it's one about I call it one's own gift, one's destiny, the thing that you bring to reality that nobody else can bring, your calling, your purpose, that kind of thing. It's about expressing that. And, the people who do that really do radiate this energy, this frequency out, which matures the whole universe. It kind of brings the universe and like society and the planet further along in their evolution. And then 8 is, and I'm pretty sure there's ones after this that I just haven't really identified yet, but 8 is like this sensation of, like, I call it the transpersonal, expanding beyond the limited self, kind of getting this bigger feeling of consciousness to yourself that's perhaps beyond just little Paul or Peter or whomever else. So people get stuck there, and when they get stuck, their pathology manifests and like other things tend to come in and like mess them up.
So this, what you were saying resonates with me so much. And I have been very lucky physically that I haven't had any major health issues. I do struggle with some mental health and some anxiety, but for the most part, I find that it's manageable. My life has always been pretty consistent. I do have points of struggle, but nothing that I can't sort of get myself out of. With whatever I need to do. But the one thing that's interesting is, like, I do without a doubt believe that when we get stuck emotionally somewhere, that if we do not find a way to process or release that, that it will manifest in our body in some way. I do believe that. Now, my personal experience with this has been with Evan. When Evan got really, really sick and he had a tumor in his chest and he has autoimmune disease, and we were very much in this world of feeling like, you know, if we get sick, it's something that we need to heal in our bodies. And there's a few things. One, when Evan used to meditate, he would always talk about how he really felt his heart chakra, his heart chakra, his heart chakra, and that's actually where his tumor was. And so it was like a physical sensation he was interpreting as spiritual, but was actually a physical object in his chest. And two, when he started going through the healing process, he had a naturopathic doctor who had the same autoimmune disease as him tell him that, you know, don't go on steroids, don't get the tumor removed. We can heal your trauma from your childhood and this will dissolve the tumor. And I remember getting that and being like, I think like theoretically it makes sense. I understand what you're saying. If we can find a way to really heal the pain of your childhood or whatever it is, then we can find a way to heal that. I do actually believe if humans were able to do that kind of rapid healing, that could work. We aren't. And so I think the problem with me is when people, the issue that I have is when people have these extreme physical manifestations of disease, like tumors, like autoimmune disease, and they turn to natural medicine, but maybe natural medicine isn't able to help in the time frame they need before they die, basically.
Well, that is a critical issue. And so that is, you know, I was very familiar with Evan's situation and so forth. So, you know, there are, I would not, I do not define naturopathic medicine as only, you know, homeopathy or herbs or acupuncture or anything. Naturopathic medicine can use any substance to assist the healing process of the body, to assist, it's called vitalism. You know, we have a vital force. Our job is to support it and help it do its thing. It's purposeful. When it's doing something, it's either trying to mitigate something or trying to accomplish something. It may not be doing so quite all that well. It may be doing a really shitty job of it, but it's trying that. There are times when stabilizing measures are quite important. Evan, like many autoimmune diseases, you know, you don't need them. You know, if you've got like early stage rheumatoid arthritis or something like that, and you know your joints are a little stiff, totally, you know, you can probably deal with that way. Evan's condition, particularly because it was affecting his breathing, was a bit more urgent, and there are times when I would suggest that a suppressive thing like, you know, an anti-inflammatory or a steroid would be a naturopathic intervention, because you know you can't operate, you can't work with the vital force because you know you're dead. It's very similar thing. I do IV therapies occasionally, and you know, one of the, you know, if someone does develop an anaphylactic reaction, so an anaphylactic reaction is when, you know, you have a really severe allergy and your throat closes up and you can't breathe. You know, the treatment is almost identical. You know, you kind of just go in, you get a little vial of epinephrine, you just inject it into someone subcutaneously, and then, you know, it's like just do a couple, you know, like do 0.2 cc's. Hey, feeling better? No, 0.4. There you go, you can breathe again. So there are, I do not accept that there are differences, that there is a differentiation between those things. There's a legal differentiation in Canada, certainly. I'm a licensed naturopath, or I'm a regulated naturopathic doctor by the College of Naturopathic Doctors of Alberta. That gives me a fair amount of access to restricted acts. Like I can inject things, I can make a naturopathic diagnosis, I can do a bunch of things, but I don't have the ability to say admit someone to a hospital. That's not that's done. I don't have the ability to order imaging in Alberta. I don't have the ability to do things like vaccination or whatever else if I wanted to do that. So there is a, shall we say, a legal barrier that kind of requires the separation of the professions there. If we lived in a just world, if we lived in, say, India, where naturopathic and homeopathic doctors have all of those things, you know, I think it's perfectly possible for that, you know, someone like Evan's condition could be managed that way. And maybe it would be a very similar management style. Someone comes in, you know, breathing difficulties because they've got, you know, a condition like that. in a naturopathic hospital, they might get a little round of cortisone to stabilize their breathing and stop an autoimmune condition. And then on top of that, afterwards, address those other issues. When you got a little time to do that, you can do a lot. When I work with
Yeah.
cancer, that's what we do. Quite often, people come to me after a cancer diagnosis when they're in the thing, and like, Paul, do you want me to stop chemo or stop the diagnostic process? I'm like, no, I do not want that. There's patients where they choose not to go through things like that when it's like, all right, I've got end stage 4 cancer with metastases in a bunch of places. The MDs are recommending chemo and radiation, but it's not really going to do much. Maybe I'll work with them that way, and with the expectation that this is a palliative care pace, that we're just going to kind of ease your transition into the thing. Sometimes you get really interesting results that way. One of my cases, I love her. I call her Mabel, but her name is not actually Mabel. She came to me with thymic carcinoma. That is a really serious cancer. Like, most, like the 50%, the median survival time, so 50% of people alive versus 50% of people are dead, are it's about 6 months. So she was in her 60s. She wanted to see the birth of her grandchild, and her one of her kids just got pregnant, and so forth. She wanted to see these things. I'm like, all right, Mabel, I will work with you. She kind of came into me beforehand, because she was having some chest difficulties and everything. She was having some breathing things. We started work, and then this came up midway, and I was like, okay, I can refer you to a friend of mine if you want to do that. She didn't. She wanted to stay with me. We had a good rapport, and we worked on her. And this doesn't happen to every case, but so I started her on a remedy, a couple of remedies, and we did some things together, and we reworked how she was treating she was getting like bronchitis every couple of weeks, so we reworked how she was doing that, so that the way she was treating it wasn't making her worse, it was making her better. And we did a lot of work, and the tumor just kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, like to the extent that they never actually did. They took out one of the metastases, but the primary tumor they never took out. It just kind of shrank into nothing.
What?
And it's been 4 years, and she's good. She wants to see her kid, and she's gone through a lot of stuff with one of her kids, because one of her kids had some addiction problems, and she was super stressed out about that. But she's still alive, and she's still happy. These things happen.
Wow, that is so good.
I encouraged her to go and go through the process and everything else. Mabel, go through and do it. She did, and everything else. But yeah, that's kind of it. Sometimes you get these things, and in a just world, we'd have a system that permitted the choice of medicine, that for people to choose medical care that way. It's like, you want naturopathic emergency care? Well, there you go. It's over there.
Yeah.
You can choose.
Yeah.
So I think we definitely can offer such things if we had the legal ability and the money to do so, but we don't.
Yeah. I have another question. I have two more that I want to ask you before we wrap up. One is, the emergence of natural medicine, I think, happened before, like a long time ago. I mean, before we really had technology and before we had advanced so much as a society. So some may argue, it's kind of out of date. Like, why go back in time when we can use these things that are so much faster and accessible, and can actually fix you right now, instead of going through the natural process, which can sometimes take longer. And it was created so long ago. Why go back in time? Why don't we just move forward with science?
Well, this is an interesting line of thinking. So that presumes, theoretically, again, as we discussed earlier, that there's some kind of diverging line between the science and naturopathic medicine. That is part of that materialist ideology. That is also bullshit. If I go and if I use, say, let's say, like, the thing I want as a practitioner right now is, I want what Theranos is this American lab company, was trying to do. I want a little thing on my desk that can put a like drop of blood in, and it'll tell me all the lab work I could ever possibly want, and more that I don't want. I want that. That's a very sciencey thing. If I use that to inform my treatments as a naturopathic doctor, am I no longer a naturopathic doctor? No, of course I am. The ideas, what we have particularly in kind of the Western tradition, there have been these two medical traditions fighting and in conflict, and perhaps even mutually enriching, for as long as we have textual records. So the Hippocratic Corpus, one of the earliest records of medicine, legendarily written only by Hippocrates. We know that that's not true. There's like maybe 100 documents, and they're all kind of, there's 4 major groups. They show a conflict between what we might call proto-naturopathic or proto-vitalistic thinking and proto-allopathic or proto-conventional thinking, and they were perhaps finalized 2,500 years ago. There are 2 schools of medicine primarily in the West, and many little sub-schools and many reincarnations. Naturopathic medicine is the latest reincarnation of what I term vitalist medicine. But there are these 2 basic schools that have been relatively unchanged, regardless of how regardless of like the sciences of the time, regardless of the political and sociocultural circumstances. The first of which is kind of the one that's dominant now, and it's historically always been dominant. It's always been about 90% of practitioners. And it's called, I term it the allopathic school. It has 3-ish basic ideas. The idea that the body is a complex machine. It doesn't have any kind of consciousness or anything else associated with it. The body is a complex machine. The machine breaks down occasionally. This breakdown, because the body is a machine, it can only break down in certain ways. Your car can only break down in a certain number of ways. This gives rise to the idea of in philosophical terms, the entity, the disease, that there are a number of categories of breakdown, and you can say that 2 people are breaking down in the same way in their machine. And the third of which is that the treatment for this breakdown is to restore it to statistical norms that you'd find in health. Those are the 3 basic tenets of that system. That has been unchanged since it emerged, kind of in that Hippocratic period. There were 2 kind of disputing groups of physicians in ancient Greece: the physicians of Cnidus and the physicians of Kos. Kos, proto-naturopaths; Cnidus, proto-allopaths or proto-conventional doctors. Whether that describing that machine in terms of function that they did in ancient Greece, the 4 elements, whether they're describing it in terms of the humors of the body, whether they're describing it now in terms of physiology and chemistry, it's the same idea, reincarnated through successive professions.
Wow.
And through successive things. There's been an explosion of scientific knowledge in the last year, and that, those allopaths have really drawn upon. That has not changed the fundamentals of their philosophy. They draw on those sciences to enrich their practice of medicine. So they are not scientific per se. They are using the sciences to enhance their practice. Naturopathic doctors, there are different things. There are different sets of assumptions and different, shall we say, axioms, you might call them, that the body is a unified whole. Its actions are purposeful. When it's doing something, when disease happens, it is trying to regulate itself. It may not be trying particularly well or smartly. There may be impediments to its regulation, but it is trying that. And oh God, body's unified whole. Regulation is that way. And that the key to therapy is to aid the body in its regulation, to help it become more efficient, which is what I do with homeopathy a lot of the time, and to supply it with the fuel it needs in order to do that. Nutritional therapies tend to come into that way. So as you can see, that has come and reincarnated throughout 100 things. Like in the 19th century, the professions doing that were the homeopaths, osteopaths, eclectics, and hydropaths, and all of them kind of smushed together to become naturopathic medicine in the century, and so forth. So naturopathic medicine, I think, is the latest incarnation of this. But as you can see, those two different ideas around health and illness and disease, they really, they interpret things like biochemistry, like the sciences. They draw upon them and enrich their practices with them, but towards very different ends. If I'm using blood chemistry to determine the fuel a person needs versus using blood chemistry to determine their malfunction so I can correct it and return that person to statistical norms, those are both using the sciences, I'm making quotation marks, but they're both drawing upon it based on very different ideologies, and the anthropologist in me says ethno-medical models of health. You know, there are systems of health and disease, and understanding those that we understand very well from anthropology, and we just kind of have lost sight of the fact that there's more than one in kind of the cultural experiment that is Western society.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah, it does. I love it's the approach that's different. I mean, you bring up really great points, and I do feel like there's clarity there. Is it's not that naturopathic hasn't developed at all. It's just there is two approaches, and I mean, I do feel like the MDs get more money, more access, more screen time, more everything. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I know that I've talked to you a little bit about that, about why we tend to favor that side of things.
Yeah.
Is there a way for you to briefly tell us why you think that is? Why naturopaths don't get the same amount of access, money, support, news time, blah, blah, blah?
I think it's a cultural. I think so. That materialism thing I talked about is big. It's
Yeah.
fun. I'm sure you've noticed this being a spiritual person yourself, and you discuss this with some people. There's like this factor. There's like this draw away thing because it is such a vast thing. That bias really has kind of, it really is kind of much more allied to that allopathic mechanical way of looking at things.
Yeah.
So other professions that lie outside of that are forced to either adapt to it, as many naturopathic doctors have chosen to do, and they're free to do that if they want to, but why would you? Or to be marginalized. So those are the two things. There's this dominant idea, this dominant materialistic paradigm in society. Anyone outside of that is marginalized that way. Like the education of the average medical doctor in Canada, I wrote a blog post about this and I calculated it out based on parliamentary reports, so a family doctor gets a $600,000 subsidy to their education from the public. Doesn't mean they don't pay extra and they don't have student loan debt, but the public will pay $600,000 on average to educate a family medical doctor in Canada. You know how much I get? Zero
Wow.
dollars. There's about $1 billion a year spent on medical research in Canada, and this is kind of my next little project, publicly. You want to guess how much naturopathic doctors or any kind of holistic research gets? I don't have an exact number right now, but I'm gonna guess that it's gonna be close to zero. So it's very easy to say, there's not a lot of this or not a lot of that. We still do produce a fair amount of research. We have, research budgets, almost all of which is raised privately to do this. But, and in terms of like the hundreds of billions of dollars that Canada or the United States spends on these kinds of, on medicine, almost none goes to us. It's very easy
Yeah.
to say, there's, it's not accessible. Well, someone's got to pay for it. Whether, medical doctors don't do this for free either. They get subsidized quite a bit. There's
Yeah.
issues of accessibility there, which lead to increased cultural prominence. There's issues of lack of research funding, and there's issues of cultural bias there. So
Yeah.
that is where I think we are less prominent. And of course, issues of scope of practice. I would like a full scope of practice as a doctor. I don't have one in Alberta. I wouldn't even have one in BC, or I think I'd have one in Arizona or Oregon if I moved there, but like I don't want to live in the States. So, and I do actually quite like Calgary.
Yeah,
So
I know you do. You're a huge Calgary fan. I think that's great.
anyway,
I like Calgary now more now that I'm not there. I go back and I appreciate it.
yeah,
Okay, to wrap things up,
yes.
tell me about the current COVID situation through a naturopathic lens. What are you interpreting about the virus, about how we're treating it, about how the governments are handling the situation?
It's funny too, because, one of the big things in that conspirituality discourse is this almost contrarian idea about COVID. COVID is a very serious infection for many people. I am quite in support of things like masking mandates and social distancing. And like Calgary last night, we just got we're not in lockdown, but we're like a step below it
Yeah,
because we've been having, we had 1,500 cases, on Sunday and so forth. We're having quite a big surge in Alberta at the moment. So I am not of the opinion that this is something to be, willy-nilly about. This is potentially a very severe infection. I will, however, say that it has been, what's the word? So I'm in support of all those because, I think we know also that the vast majority of people survive this, and many people have this infection without knowing. there are that I think has not been, they've not spent nearly enough time differentiating, you know, the people who are asymptomatic and are exposed and, you know, nothing happens versus the people who have very severe outcomes. That's where the naturopathic doctor comes from in me. Why are those people different? Why are some people doing this and why are some people not? I'm very much in support of distancing and minimizing infection because there's a lot of people who, if it was allowed to spread freely, would have very severe outcomes, would die, and would often have lifelong issues. I would suggest that the public health measures are not paying adequate attention to those factors that separate people who have, you know, almost no problems with it to the people who have very difficult problems, and that is where we should be focusing attention on in society, as opposed to simply that and you know, pay and simply isolating and waiting for a vaccine to occur. So
Yeah,
that's
because
kind of
waiting for, yeah, well, because like, so what you're saying is there are people who will have a serious effect by this, and we need to take that seriously, but we also need to remember that it's a smaller part of the population and focus on them and let the rest of the people who are relatively healthy do what they want. Is that what you're
no,
saying?
no, that is absolutely not what I'm saying. We tried that. We tried that in Alberta, and that failed miserably.
Okay.
They tried being very careful around the elderly and so forth. And you know what? There's more infections in care homes than ever. So letting everyone else do what they want, there is a significant, the way our society is organized, there's a significant amount of spread that way. I am suggesting that there are other factors that are not entirely clear right now, which, you know, differentiate people who we know age, we know a couple of them that would make an infection with COVID be potentially deadly versus being potentially almost asymptomatic. What separates those two things? If we knew, if we spent society resources examining these, could we change those for people?
Right.
Could we,
right.
before a vaccine came, could we shift some of people from, you know, who would potentially have a really rough time to people who would have a really, you know, much more mild time? This, and I can tell you as a naturopathic doctor, if that was the case, we would have vast health improvements beyond just a response to COVID. So
yeah.
that is my thing on COVID, is that I am in support of all the public health measures as they are now. I would add to them a research emphasis on figuring out, on differentiating those two things and so forth. I think, yeah, that's my thing. So I'm
Love it.
not buying into the conspiratorial view of that it's some way to do everything. It is a very serious disease, but I'm also not buying into the materialist idea that it's just like materialists on infections, like, you know, you just exposed and blah. It completely ignores the intrinsic characteristics of the person being infected, which make a vast difference.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I think that's a really great way. Like, why do some people get sicker than the others? If we can figure that out, then we have that will affect your strategy greatly, and I think it'll make it be more effective. So I hope that they start doing that. And Paul, thank you so much. That
thank
was
you for having me.
such a great conversation. I can't wait for people to come. I've been wanting to bring you on for a while. I was just trying to think of like how, like in what capacity. And I feel like this show started super focused on like celebrities and pop culture, but now the conversations I'm having are much more broader range spiritual health topics. And I think that's why now is a great time to have you on, because we covered like undeniably spiritual concepts, but also, you know, they surpass that as well. And I'm so happy to know you. And I'm so grateful that you spent the time with us this morning.
Oh, I'm so happy to reconnect with you, Peter. I do adore you.
Ditto, ditto. And hopefully I get to come to Calgary soon and we can hang out again.
I have a nice place. I have a new place where you can stay if you want to come.
Oh my God. Do I have my own room?
Yes, I do. This is also my spare bedroom. So, you know.
Oh my God. Oh my God. That's so exciting. Well, I look forward to that, Paul. Thank you so much. Have a great day and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. See you soon, Peter.
Bye.